All right, so I hope this one will be a short video on the consent argument again. This is the third one that I'm making because it seems that there are still people who think that the fact that we don't exist before come into being, that kind of destroys the whole concept of consent. And I'm just trying to show why that's absurd and the consent argument still works. All right, so let's just start with just basics. Like, let's go back to the question of why even consent is important to us. Now, you can have your own answer. The way that I'm looking at it is my assumption that moral basis that I'm working on is that rational beings, entities like you and I, we should be free in our judgment. We are a rational being in a sense that we can judge what's good and what's not for us. That's something in our power. And I believe that rational beings should be free in their judgment. There should not be any kind of imposition on a rational being, which means that if a rational being is in a state, like the way that I'm, like, the state means the property is having some properties, like the way that I have talking to you, that's a property that I'm having right now, so that's a state I'm in. That's not imposed on me. That's something that I've decided to do. So that's not an imposition. So when we talk about consent, it's always relative to a specific state. So when you consent to a state S, I define it as a confirmation that the state S is not or is not going to be imposed on you. So for example, if when you ask someone whether you can have sex with them, that's ask for consent to S. That's something that happens, means that you're confirming that that state of sex in the future is not imposed on you. So consent is important because basically you're confirming that that state is not imposed on you. So you as a rational being, you are still free in the judgment on the state in which you are now. So that's the basic definitions that I work with. Of course, we can have discussions on that as well, but I believe this is pretty standard. So the first thing is that it seems that people are very concerned about the fact that when something happens, you actually give consent, like an event prior to what you are consenting to. That's like when you go to doctor and you sign something. But to me, the main core of the whole concept of consent is about the state. And I'm trying to show this with these two examples. So consider these two cases. One is that you ask for consent for sex again, and you say no, but there is no such state as having sex. So you don't have sex. You watch Netflix, for instance. In the second case, you ask for consent for S, that is the sex, and then you say no, but you do have sex. Well, that's rape, right? Now, the idea is that if consent is only an event that's happening prior to some other state, then there's something fishy going on here, because in one case, it's a mundane, very normal, benign situation, the first case. The second case is a serious event. But the point is that everything prior to, I wrote here dinner, but I don't mean dinner. I changed the example. But everything prior to S is identical in both cases. So if we are only looking at everything prior to S, then they're both identical. You ask a question, you ask, can we have S? And then you answer no. Both are identical. So how come that the outcome is so different morally? Well, of course, because what happened prior to S, on its own, it's really morally irrelevant. It only becomes important comparing to the state that you will actually be in. So it's whether the state is imposed or not that matters morally, not what happens before that. So in my understanding, focusing on this specific event prior to S as if it's morally significant on its own, it doesn't make sense to me. Because again, the first case is very benign. You just ask for consent. Hey, can I I don't know, give you that specific food? And then you say no. Okay, then it's over. There's nothing wrong with it. It's all about consent in the end, about the state in which you are. And if that state is imposed on you, then that's bad. And consent is just a way of confirming that that state is not imposed on you. The other points that people try to make, which is kind of relevant to the first point, is the capacity of consent. Suppose you have this condition that you ask not for just S, sex, is actually unconscious plus sex. Like they put you in that state. So that's what they're asking you. They put you in the state of being unconscious and then having sex with you. Well, that, of course, if you say no to that, that's rape. But now suppose that you have been conscious all the way up to S. So no capacity. You didn't have any capacity to give consent to S. And the question is, does this make the situation morally better? Because the objection to the consent argument is because those who are not born do not have the capacity to consent, then somehow consent is just completely out of the window. It doesn't matter. So the question is, if you remove that capacity for consent prior to S, is the situation bottom better than the situation above? I don't think so. I think it's even worse. So the argument is that if the capacity for consent, if the lack of that capacity removes the moral significance of consent, then things should be better if you remove that consciousness, right? Because if making that person unconscious removes the capacity of consent, and if removing the capacity of consent removes the power of consent as a moral argument, then you're removing these constraints. You're removing these moral constraints, which means that you should feel more free or things should be better morally. But the point is that the situation does not get better if you remove the capacity for consent, which means that the capacity for consent does not remove the moral significance of consent. It's not about what happens before S, as I showed in the previous example, is about S. Whether S is imposed or not, whether the subject has confirmed that the state that I'm in is according to my judgment. Now, if you remove, it doesn't matter what you are going to do before that, the moral significance of this consent story is about this state. Is it imposed or is it not? It doesn't matter what happens before that. Again, as I showed in the previous example, you can have two identical prior history while completely different story morally. So now suppose you take that one more step to get closer to antinatalist condition. Now suppose that you do not even exist all the way up to S. So now the state of S is now even existence, because that's a new thing. You don't exist prior to that. And unconscious and sex on top of that. Now, in my opinion, things are now even worse because now existence is also added as a not consented state. You did not consent to sex, you did not consent to having sex while being unconscious, and now you also didn't consent to existing and having sex while being unconscious. That's rape again. Again, this is rape and this is bad. It doesn't matter what happens prior to S. Whatever happens prior to S is about the judgment of the state S. If S is imposed, if S is something that you as a rational being did not confirm as being according to your judgment, then it is imposed on you, and that's a violation of consent. So I don't see how removing the capacity for consent is going to make things better, Somehow, this person who just suddenly exists and is in the state of being unconscious and is in the state of having sex, that's something, like suppose that someone jumps into adulthood, just comes into existence as an adult and finds itself in that state. Somehow that's fine because, well, they didn't have any capacity to give consent prior to that. I'm like, that's just completely irrelevant. The whole story prior to what happens to S is to get information about what's happening in the S right now. But when you remove all of that possibility, that capacity just removes all the possibility for giving any kind of confirmation that the state that we are in aligns with the judgment of that rational person, then you just made things much worse. So let's go back to the consent argument. Giving birth imposes states upon states, existence, and all the rest. Therefore, it's wrong. And before I finish this, again, let's go back to this objection, that if we give such an importance to consent, then even some necessary acts, such as feeding children, become morally wrong, right? Because, when someone is born, they cannot consent to a lot of things, to getting vaccinated, to going to school, to feeding. But this is absurd. So consent is not important. So this is supposed to be like a reductio ad absurdum argument against using consent. But the point is that this argument, this reductio argument, only works if it is absurd to have an action so evil that makes further evil acts necessary. If this were absurd, then I would agree that objection works. But the point is that this is not absurd. You can have acts that are so evil that just, like, there are like these points of no return. When you pass that line, there's no way out of that for you unless you do even more evil. That's like, you can't think about different examples. And like some killings that you just have to kill more to get out of it. Some lies that you just have to lie more to get out of it necessarily. And that doesn't mean just because you did something that necessarily leads to some other evil acts, then the original act was good. If you do something that makes slavery, for instance, a necessary evil that will follow from it, is something that you have to do afterwards, that just doesn't make the first act good. It just makes it even worse. Right? So the correct conclusion from this observation, like if we give importance to consent and we realize, okay, giving birth is such a bad thing, bringing someone into existence is such a bad thing, and then you say, okay, this leads to lots of necessary things, like everything else would be bad, therefore this is good, the original act. No, the correct conclusion is that this initial act is so evil that it necessarily leads to these other evil acts. You cannot do this, that's giving birth, and not do all the rest. It's strange because we do the same thing for many other acts. Like if you want to, I don't know, scare someone of addiction, you will tell them, look, if you do this, it will just chain you to a lot of bad things that will necessarily happen to you. Because of that, you will have to do this thing, and then you will have to steal money, and then you will do that, and you will lose this, and you will lose that. So even the possibility of a lot of these things is enough to scare someone of an act. But if you tell them that, hey, it necessarily leads to all of those things, then this objection says, okay, then the original thing is fine. That doesn't make any sense. And of course, at this point, the objection might continue to say, yeah, but the difference is that those acts are not natural things, like stealing and killing, all of these things. But feeding children, that's a completely natural act. But of course, that's begging the question, right? just because we are doing it for so long doesn't mean that it's right, because, I mean, antinatalism is about giving birth. What's more natural than that? But if you're trying to attack that part, then we cannot just assume just because it's something natural that we all are doing, and we have been doing for millions of years, then it doesn't mean that it's right. And if you're attacking that point, that we cannot just assume just because it's natural, then it's good. So in my opinion, I know that it sounds a little bit too extreme for the consent part, but I don't see it as extreme. I just see the act of procreation in such a negative light that I can clearly see how all of this evil can come out of that thing. It's such an act that you just enslave someone and you put them in such a position that they will be you not only impose life onto them, but you also impose many years of further violations upon them. And if we understand that clearly, then we see that there is no absurdity in this argument. So I hope this clear things up, because again, in my opinion, whoever trying to come up with these different objections, I guess they just missed the point about why consent was important in the first place. And if we get to the fact that consent is just about this estate, then I guess everything can be cleared up. Cheers.